How is this? Good. All right. We're going? All right. We're studying the astrological aspects because they're the most important part of applied astrology. And we're trying to understand what they point to in the workings of our consciousness. And we began last year with looking at the aspects in static geometric form. And then we looked at a lot of examples. Now we're looking at a dynamic view of the aspects. And in that, what we are saying is that the aspects are turning points in ongoing dynamic cycles that are continuous. They represent the critical points and the things that happen that change the direction of a cycle. Aspects are also the points when things in an ongoing cycle get accomplished in either the doing or the undoing of the work of the planets involved in the cycle. And last time we introduced it by looking at the lunation cycle, which is the simple cycle of the sun and moon from new moon until the next new moon. And in that we tried to demonstrate the basic principles. And we did that because the lunation cycle is the most basic of all cycles. It is the cycle to which most people are aware, and it is a cycle that everybody knows affects things in their life, whether they study astrology or not. So for tonight and the next few meetings, we're going to look at the aspects in the lunation cycle by looking at the horoscopes of illustrious people, and hopefully we can understand the ideas much better as a consequence of this. Now, we're going to study the two conjunctions of the sun and moon tonight. By the two conjunctions, it means the separating conjunction and the applying conjunction. It is stated this way because the separating conjunction is at the very beginning of the cycle, and the applying conjunction is at the very end of the cycle. Now, it's true that there may be some anticipation in the applying cycle. However, the actual application itself and the beginnings don't begin until when the conjunction has been formed. Now we're going to begin looking first at the separating conjunction, which we call the constructive conjunction or the first conjunction. Now, it's imperative when we look at these horoscopes to keep in mind that we're looking at only this one feature and not the whole horoscope. And we're looking at this one feature just for purposes of illustration. In some cases, it may not be the most important feature. I try to avoid that if possible. So what we're saying is we're not going to look at the whole horoscope, though we may look at a few other things as they relate to understanding what we're trying to look at. I may make a few sidelong comments here and there, which some people would not call sidelong commentary, they would call cheap shots. A lot of times I choose the charts not only because they are really good examples, but because they are people that fascinate me, or what they did in history fascinates me, even if they aren't fascinating themselves. So please remember that these selections are chosen because they're clear and obvious. They're standout examples of the principles we're trying to put forth. Now, when you start looking at all horoscopes, it might not be that simple, but if you can see it in simple first, then you can see it later on in more complexity. All right, so if the first conjunction is the beginning of something, it is a good time to look at the horoscope of a founder. And this is the horoscope of Max Heindel, who was the founder of the Rosicrucian Fellowship. We look at the conjunction of sun and moon, and it's in a fixed sign. And so you can see that this is somebody that is going to have a lot of staying power. And so that's something you want if you have a fledgling thing that's supposed to be an institution that's supposed to last for at least a couple of centuries. It's also a fiery conjunction, so there is a very spirited initiative, and that whatever is founded at this time is always going to have people associated with it that are highly spirited. Now, it conjoins the ascendant, and that makes for a redundancy. It's saying that the sun and the moon and the ascendant are all pointing at the same thing. And so this is a very good beginning time. Now, if you look at the sun in this horoscope, it's separating from a square to Saturn. And the moon is applying to a trine of Neptune. So you can say that the new moon has a flavor about it, that it is going away from personal limitation and darkness and selfishness, and it's moving toward spirituality, which is exactly what was necessary for founding a spiritual organization. Now, neither of these outside aspects is strong. They are minor, in fact, in their strength. So this makes the sun and moon conjunction stand out really, really strong. And it means that you have a powerful leonine individualism. Now that makes it good for the leader, and that makes it good for founding, but it doesn't make it so easy for those who follow after, because those who are willing to follow are people who will knuckle under, so to speak. And if someone has a lot of individual initiative and incentive on their own, that can be a detriment. So we can see that this is an ardently strong individual, and there's no doubt about his intentions, which are straightforward and quite noble and high-minded. Now the conjunction is in the 12th house, so he does try to downplay himself as a founder. In fact, he rarely talks about personal experience. But his character is so strong that it shines through anyway. All right, let's...
I missed something. Did you say something about the sun separating from a square of Saturn?
Yes. Yeah. When it was back in 26, of Cancer, it was square to Saturn. It's a six-degree orb, which is the last aspect that it made. The previous.
The conjunction itself is a separating one, correct?
That's correct. All of them, for the first part of these, are going to be separating conjunctions. All right, now let's look at a founder of another type. It's the horoscope of Paul Hindemith. Everybody knows who Paul Hindemith is. He was a composer, he was a theoretician, he was a performer, and he was a promoter. Yeah. Yeah. He has Leo rising and Jupiter is near the ascendant. And the Sun conjoined Moon is in the 5th house. So the 5th house and the 5th sign are accentuated, which is excellent for expression. And he began his expression very early. His father and mother were both musicians, and they knew that he would never come to great wealth as a musician, so they forbade him to study music. And at age 11, he ran away from home. And he supported himself by playing in beer halls and dance bands and things like that. And he eventually paid for his education in this way. So there is, there's this type of character. If a person is not discerning, it's very hard to understand, because on the surface he seems so positive and so cheery, but inwardly he's very dark and very divided. The conjunction of the Sun and the Moon is in Scorpio, which is dark and discordant. And there is also, in that 4th house, there is that very strong conjunction between Mars and Saturn in Scorpio, which is even more dark and discordant. And Uranus is in Scorpio also, which is extremely rebellious. It's good for somebody to do something new, but it's, this is a pretty discordant kind of chart. So he was, he chose his musician very well, and he eventually ended up at a conservatory and was a very respected professor. And he promoted the works of other people, most notably Schoenberg and Albenberg and all of those people who belong to new music, which some people wouldn't even call music at all because it's so harsh. And one of the key words of Scorpio is dissonance. And when he did his own composing, a lot of the music was highly dissonant, which as a consequence, it was banned by Hitler. So yeah. So he came to the United States, and he taught at Yale, and he taught at Harvard, and a number of other places. And while at Harvard, he wrote a very famous book on harmonics, which, among other things, talks about spirituality in the 7th octave, where things start getting really weird and eerie. And all of the music world has great respect for him as a composer and as a theoretician, but there were raised eyebrows at what they considered mysticism. Now, he's not a formal founder, but Scorpio doesn't like formality anyway, especially when Uranus is there. So he was an informal founder. All right, let's look at the horoscope of a school of music. Yeah, he was one of the pioneers in what is called, I guess, modern music.
You said Scorpio doesn't like what?
Doesn't like a lot of formality.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you sneaked in here so quietly I didn't even see you at all. So it seems then that Scorpio doesn't have a corner on sneakiness. I'm in a light, teasy kind of mood tonight. Now, this is another person that is sort of a founder and is sort of not a founder, and probably the only person in the room who knows her is Julie. And it is not so much the founder of a movement as the founder of quite a few different bands. This is the horoscope of Annie Lennox. Everybody know, you know who she is, don't you, Julie?
Furnace maker?
Her father was. Her father was a boiler maker, as a matter of fact.
What made you say that, Jerry?
Yes.
What made you say that?
She's the most famous band that she founded was called the Eurythmics.
Oh,
And she was in a few other of those very avant-garde groups that were more than just rock. They were somewhere between rock and classical music, or music accepted by the majority. She was not reluctant about music. She said she was willing to wait on tables to be able to do the music that she wanted to do, and she did so. At several times, she took waiting on tables and other jobs in order to do what she wanted to do. She's born, as you can see, in Scotland, and her parents were very poor, and they had what it would be called the Scotch frugality, and they saved money to give her music lessons. And she made it all the way to the prestigious London Conservatory of Music, where she was a flautist. And she went all the way until her final recital, and she dropped out. She disappeared. And when she surfaced, she came up with experimental music and pop music. At several times in her life, she made very abrupt changes, very new moon-like changes. They were not abrupt to her because they were working in her consciously or semi-consciously in her subconscious. She again has all of this stuff down in the fourth house, which indicates that things are initiated below the threshold of consciousness and certainly below the awareness of the world. But when she gets to a point, Capricorn is like that, when it gets to a point, she comes out and everyone is surprised. Capricorn is one of those seemingly secretive signs, but for her it was just a matter of privacy, because she had led such an erratic life. At one time she married a mystic of all things, a yogi that she fell in love with, and they were together for a few years and everything deteriorated, and then she went back to her old way of living. So if we look at this, this is there are hard lives because of the stress of it. If you see, the sun is conjoined to the dragon's head, and that means that the new moon that the moon is just coming out of was an eclipse, and people who have eclipse lives have much more stressful lives.
the sun is coming out of the dragon's head?
Yeah, the sun is conjoined to dragon's head. See, this is the dragon's head, which is the moon's load. Right in between Mercury and the moon is the dragon's head. And if there is a new moon or a full moon within 3 degrees of the dragon's head or dragon's tail, it has to be an eclipse. Okay, so
So they have turbulent lives?
yes, because of the stress. Because things are really, I have one friend that ran for senator in Virginia recently, and she was born with something like 5 or 6 planets conjoined an eclipse. Very amazing person. Her sister, everybody knows her sister. Her sister is Greta Van Susteren. If you know the name Greta Van Susteren, she was the lawyer during the OJ trials that made all the commentary, and now she's just the general media person. All right. Now we have the horoscope of one of the most brilliant people of the 20th century. This is John Maynard Keynes. Among other things, he is the architect or designer of the International Monetary Fund. He is the designer of the World Bank, and he is the originator of Keynesian economics. With all of those planets in Gemini, he is someone that believes in the free flow of things. And he was the one that brought things out of the perspective of Victorian times where people did invest, or that people would not buy things until they had saved the money, and people saved money for security. And basically, this is the man that said to the world, if one person spends $1, the person who receives that dollar, if they spend it, that dollar gets used many times over, and it is worth more than $1. And being a 10th house person, as much as he is, he believed that the hierarchy, that is the government, should be a big player in the economy. And so this is the economist whose ideas were behind the New Deal by Roosevelt, which has worked very well in bringing us out of a major depression. And it was a major depression that was in a liberal side of politics, so something like this could be instituted. His major work, or his first major book that got him famous, he was tried to be a mathematician but couldn't make it, and he tried to be a number of other things, but he fit in brilliantly with economics right from the beginning. He talked about the stability of a peaceful economy. And what he did is he wrote about the fact that if people live in peace, that there's much more likely to be prosperity, because there were people that believed that if you had the crisis of war, that you would have a much more, that it would be good for the economy. And that was believed for a long time, and he demonstrated quite clearly that that was not the case. This is a Gemini new moon. And not only did he initiate all these things in economics, a lot of people considered him to be two-faced. And he's hated by both the right and by the left. So that even though he instituted government spending and things like that, he believed in capitalism. And he has been one of the most shrewd capitalistic investors in history, in the London market and in the market in the United States. He had the intuition. The Neptune-Venus, I suppose, has something to do with it. The planets, the sun and the moon, even though they're square to Uranus, the intuition is there. And so he has unbelievable accuracy. So he was disliked by everyone. He's very Gemini in that he played both sides of everything. He was an outright homosexual, and he was part of the Bloomsbury Circle with all of those people like Virginia Woolf and Bertrand Russell and people like that. But at the same time, for the last 20 years of his life, he had an amazingly successful marriage. And everybody, by this time the world knew that he was a homosexual, and they said, what is he doing this for? And he loved the woman. They had a good relationship, and the whole idea that, so I guess you'd have to say that he was bisexual. Again, one of those Gemini kinds of things. What was that?
Can you, just for my overview, what's the key word for the separating conjunction?
Foundation.
Foundation.
Initiation. New beginnings. Innovation. Any of those kinds of things. But foundation is probably the best. Well, now we have the horoscope of a French pastry chef. A very good French pastry chef.
Oh, was a baker.
Yes? Yes. high-class French pastry chef. This is the founder of the modern nation of Vietnam, though he probably wouldn't like what he sees Vietnam has become, because he was a hardline, very traditional communist, and a materialistic communist at that. Oh, I guess all communists are materialists because they don't have a lot of spirituality. In fact, it's even considered superstition. It was necessary for him to be as stubborn as he was. The new moon squares Saturn, and the square is quite strong. So he had to be stubborn, and he's somebody that dug in the more resistance that he had. And so having to fight first with French colonialism and then United States imperialism, he had to remain strong. And so it was tough. And both planets in the square showed that it was a lot of stress on him, and he toughed it out until he died of a heart attack eventually. The Pluto, Neptune, and Mercury conjoined to Mars show a charisma. He had a personal charisma. Of course, the charisma isn't always defined the same way as we define it here in the West, but he no doubt had an Oriental charisma, and even though he was quite autocratic, quite authoritarian, quite Plutonian in the way he did things, that didn't take anything away from his charisma, because that was culturally acceptable to have those attitudes. Opposite Mars, yeah. The Mars is the planet that gives the octave planets the charismatic energy. I got it wrong in my notes here. So, the way something is founded is the way it goes. And even though he was a stubborn man and he was communistic, because he was so based in materialism, the country that he formed became very materialistic. And it's not surprising that he would become, that the country would become capitalistic and market-oriented as it is now oriented. So if he had lived long enough and perhaps had purged the psyche of his side of the war of Buddhism, things might have gone differently. So, I don't know. It's hard to say.
Is the materialism coming from the sun and moon are in Taurus?
Yes, and the ascendant. Yeah. Very strongly materialistic. Even Venus in the second house has some of those tendencies. It's not very often that a person is so much of a founder that you have a whole era of history named after you. But the next person is just such a person. This is Queen Victoria of England. Of the Victorian era, she was queen for 63 years. Longer. She became queen when she was 18 years old, and she was with it longer than any other person who has ever been a queen. And during her reign, the British Empire dominated the world. But it's funny, she was not an initiator of that, because the crown was not the primary leader. And she was not a strong queen. The Gemini sun and moon does not indicate strength. She was sort of a moralist, and her moralistic tendencies are indicated by the Jupiter in the 10th house. And the Jupiter let's see, the Jupiter is it's sextile to Mars, sextile roughly to Uranus by association. And so she believed in a lot of purity. She was so much of a moralist that she had one of her ladies-in-waiting inspected to make certain that she was a virgin, because she was trying to quell all scandal about everything like that. It's not surprising that the prudery of the Victorian age was as much as it was. Her role as queen was a little bit stronger than the queen has now. The queen right now is a figurehead, but she was conservative politically and morally very conservative with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. She was extremely moralistic that way. And they squared Neptune, and that was the whole business of it. She was obsessed with public morals. Now, even though she was, how would you say it? She was a founder by accident, or rather a founder by destiny. This is not a case that from behind the scenes, like in the Max Heindel chart, she could radiate and take hold. She was somebody that, like many people of power, are isolated from the people. And in the 12th house, she was isolated, and she didn't know what the people thought. The British loved their royalty, but she was so far away from them that she wasn't loving her people. She suffered politically because she often made decisions on the basis of morality rather than on political sense. And so she became almost an afterthought by the end of her reign. So she's someone who's destined to be a person, but somebody who's destined to be a figurehead. And if she was an initializer of anything, it was an initializer of a moral state rather than initializer of a new direction of England. So she is an accidental ruler. All right, now we switch to the other side. Let's look a little bit at the second conjunction. The Sun, the second conjunction could be called the collapse conjunction or the disintegration conjunction, or it could be called the decadent conjunction. It is that it's necessary for things to break down in order for something new to take place. And when everything has been gotten out of the last cycle, then it just collapses of its own accord and the energy can be put into the new things. This is the applying conjunction, so there is a determined quality about it, and some people are bound for destruction. I think there's even a statement in our language, we say, hell-bent for election. And that describes the 12th house, so I don't think you'll find that in many astrology classes. So sometimes this quality indicates a desperation, or a person acts desperately because they realize everything is falling apart. Needless to say, the lives of people born with the second or the destructive conjunction are not always happy. The first horoscope we look at is one of somebody who is a very strong second conjunction person. It's the horoscope of a man who's had a death sentence pronounced against him and a huge reward, I think of $1 million for his death. Some of his translators have been beaten and wounded by shots, and one has even been murdered in Japan. This is the horoscope of Salman Rushdie. Funny thing of it is, he is not a highly practicing Muslim, but he is still a Muslim. In fact, he would like to see Islam reformed. Aries with Mars in the first house is rising, so it shows him to be someone who is daring. With such a combination, a person might be so daring that he might be foolhardy. The Mars is opposite of Jupiter, but his daringness or his foolhardiness is born out of personal pride. Both planets are well aspected by Mercury. Mercury sextiles Mars, which is excellent for a writer because it shows that you write with force and with directness. And Mercury is trine Jupiter, which shows that he can get the big picture. And Jupiter indicates an intellectual positivity about him, so that it's so positive that it amounts to good luck. So we can see that intellectually he's well equipped to be a writer. And the new moon that we're looking at, the final phase new moon, is in the third house, which is even more so that way. But a lot of the good taste of his writing is probably due to Venus, because Venus forms very lovely sextiles with the Saturn-Pluto in the fourth house, and it trines to Neptune, which describes, he does a lot of that fanciful realism like the South American authors used to do. And so it shows that, this is real, except for that opposition, this is really a very, very positive, pleasant horoscope. But we're interested in the second conjunction. And there is a line in On the Road by Jack Kerouac, which was sort of the Bible for my generation, the Beat generation. And that line sums it up nicely. And the Satanic Verses, like the On the Road, was written with desperate speed. Jack Kerouac put a roll of teletype paper on a typewriter and just wrote as fast as he could with stream of consciousness. And what he said was, these things are so beautiful, they had to be told. And almost all writers would agree with that. They took a survey of great writers, and they said that they do their best writing when they don't do a lot of pausing for amending or correcting or things like that, but when they're sort of like in a fever and they just throw themselves into it, and they have they work with almost compulsive speed, and that is what Rushdie is capable of doing. This is like when he has from Uranus, he has, which is conjoined the new moon, he gets the creative impulse. And it's almost like people who are compulsive possessors. You can always sell to them by saying, well, it might not be here tomorrow. And so he gets filled with the creative impulse, and he feels, I got to get this done now because it isn't going to be here. And that's the way he writes. And that's why his writing is as strong as it is. Now, Solomon.
What part is the desperation? What part shows the
The
desperation?
opposition, the second square is the desperation, second conjunction.
Which is
The sun and the moon, that the moon is falling back into the sun at the new moon.
so
And
when
that's a desperation conjunction.
the moon is on this side and the sun's on this side.
Yes, when it's behind the sun and it's coming up to the new moon. Now, Salman Rushdie was aware of the conjunction in his consciousness, and he probably took advantage of it. Queen Victoria was not aware of her conjunction so much, and she was a person of destiny. Now, not everybody is aware of the second conjunction, because it is in the dark of the moon, and there is a fated quality about it. So some people just never know that this is their fate or that this is their destiny. And we're going to look briefly at somebody that this was the case for. This is Payne Stewart, a man who won 3 major events on the golf tour. And he was very, very successful. And he was also a very excellent dresser. As you would expect with Venus rising, he was sort of the fashion plate of the golf tour. But what happened was he had his own jet. I think he had made something, to this point in his career, he had made $12 million. And he lived in Texas, and he had been in a tournament in Florida, and he set his autopilot flying back to Texas. And then suddenly the plane deviated, and it just kept on going, and it caught the attention of the FAA, and they gave him a 2-jet escort to shoot him down if it looked like he was going to crash. What had happened is a small hole formed in the cockpit, and all the pressurized air was sucked out, and everybody was suffocated almost immediately. And so and so what happened was the plane just continued on its course, the deviate course, and it went down in a field in a place called Mina, South Dakota. And this is to show another kind of fated life. It's something that is out of your control. It's desperate. The sun and the moon shows that he had, in the sextile to Saturn, shows that he had some good control, but in terms of electronic things, the opposition to Uranus, which both disposes and disposits the sun and the moon, show that he just didn't have the control, and that's what that last conjunction was like.
Wow.
Yeah, it is.
So how close of a conjunction does it need to be for that desperation effect?
I would say usually within 3 degrees, maybe even within 2.
So I've got that in my chart.
Oh, okay. Oh, maybe you're destined to greatness. You have to look it over. Now, horoscopes like that are fascinating, but you don't learn anything about character development from them, because they don't live long enough for the character to develop. So let's turn to someone who made a practical philosophy of dissolution, meaning the death of things is good for you. This is the horoscope of Pierre Pradhan. Does everybody know who Pierre Pradhan was?
No.
He was the founder of the political philosophy called anarchy. Now, the extreme left and the extreme right often agree with each other. There is a group here in Wisconsin called the Natural Foods Associates, and it's all people who grow their own food. And some of them are extreme rightists, like the Posse Comitatus, and some of them are extreme leftists, like hippies, that dropped out rather than assimilating into the Democratic Party or something like that. And you go to a natural foods convention here, and you'll find the extreme rightists and the extreme leftists being very friendly with each other and shaking their head in agreement, because they both have similar ideas. They both believe that the government is poisoning them and things like that. Leo rises, and this is the second conjunction of the sun and the moon in Capricorn in the 6th house. Now, Capricorn often means careful conservatism, But Pradhan was an extreme radical leftist. So how do we explain that? In this case, Capricorn means minimalism. And he believed that the least amount of government was the best. Sounds like the modern right, doesn't it? But he was extreme left. And so what he believed that in the same way that the extreme right means that if you take away the government, the market will correct things. He believed that if you took away the government control, the people would automatically correct things. So even though he is a conservative, he believes in the goodness of people, conservative about how things are done. Now, the Capricorn lunation isn't the only thing in this chart. There is all of that stuff in with the strong Jupiterian influence. You have the Saturn and Pluto, which are in Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, and they relate to the planets in Pisces. And so this is, he actually sort of believed that in anything goes. That, it was a kind of a positivity that was indulgent in the people. The strong Pisces flavor means that he thought the good would come out of chaos. The squares, especially the Neptune squares to the Sagittarian planets, indicates a kind of a delirious optimism, not a founded. So like his political decisions were not made mentally. His philosophy was, but his political decision was made emotionally. And emotionally he believed in chaos. Now, Uranus does form some good aspects with the planets in Pisces, so that he had some good emotional intentions, but the optimism, the delirium of that just got away from him and overrode everything. So in all of his self-conscious thinking, he saw this as a very practical thing, that the most practical form of government intellectually to him was anarchism. Oh, wait a second here. I'm missing a whole page. There. Too many notes, too many notes. There. Now we're going to look at something highly speculative and astrologically speculative. And it gives me a chance to pound my fist into my hand and propound Rosicrucian philosophy. In Rosicrucian mysticism, the claim is that when someone's body is destroyed, like by a fire or something like that, all of the memory records stored in the etheric body are lost. They still are intact in the world of thought, but it'll be a long time before most people can access them. And for now, this means that a person who dies in such a way is likely to lose the benefit of all of their moral lessons in the life they've just finished. And so something has to be done. And what does happen is that when their next life is prepared, it's prepared in such a way that they are brought to death before puberty. And this means that they are brought to death before the desire body is formed, and since is born. And since it isn't born, it can't die. And so when children die, they are taken into the desire world, and if they have a need of moral lessons, they are given object lessons in morality. Suppose somebody was a fighter in their last life and died violently in fighting, and their body was destroyed. They obviously need to learn about fighting in their next life. So what they will do, the little child, or sometimes it's even an infant, they will be given object lessons. They'll be take that child and put them in the aura of somewhere where there's a vicious fight going on. Then they will extract them from that, and they'll put them somewhere like where a symphony is going on, or where there's a prayer meeting going on, or something like that. And by many replications of these kinds of things, they get, in effect, a special moral training that isn't as strong as they would have gotten from their past life, but it's enough so that they haven't lost pace too much and fall behind, which could start a very difficult downspin. So, with this, let's look at two charts back and forth. This is,
All happens in the inner world?
yes, all happens in the inner worlds. Yeah. This is the horoscope of Salvador Guido Dali. He is not the artist. This is a child that was born and died in the year before Salvador Guido Dali was born. And this is a horoscope that if you look up from the ascendant, the first planet up is Uranus. And that is the immediate past and usually has to do with a past life. And it looks like the possibility of the immediate past life had something to do with an accident or fire or something of that nature. Looking deeper into the 12th house, deeper into the past, you see the Sun conjoined, Mars conjoined Venus in Scorpio. So this is somebody that has really strong sexual problems and a really strong sexual desire. And this is probably what was lost. If our speculation is true, this is probably what is lost. The immediate future is indicated by the first house. The ascendant is usually the now point, and going back from the ascendant is into the past, going forward is going into the future. And there we find Jupiter and Saturn in Capricorn in the first house, saying that object lessons morally are a pretty good possibility with this person. Then we look at the Sun and the Moon, and they are in that fatal conjunction, the last conjunction. They trine Pluto, saying that even though that this is a rush to death, it is a positive rush to death because Pluto is the Hades, it's the planet of death. And so speculatively it looks pretty likely that this person died to this end and for that reason.
Can I ask, okay, these things are done in the inner worlds to prepare the person for their next life.
Yes.
But if the life is available, the experiences are available in the world of thought, won't that person have gone through that?
No, they'd have to have waking consciousness, full waking consciousness in the world of thought to be able to read those records.
So they
And
don't gather that during that first time in...
no, they have some consciousness in between lives in the world of thought, but not a lot. Most people, when they in the world of thought, when they build the archetype for their next life, they have to be coached and helped out quite a bit. Most people are not. This is Max Heindel claims, for example, that one of the reasons why it takes so long for people to come back to birth is because they're such slow thinkers. Whereas if you take somebody who has developed creative thinking so that you can produce an image like an artist or somebody like that and can hold that in their consciousness, they come to birth much more quickly because they can take a thought and they can crystallize it and they can finalize it. This is often why one of the reasons why artists are born ahead of the time of their times is because they're such proficient thinkers. And not just intellectual thinkers, but thinkers that can take a thought and bring it to final fruition. All right. So,
If they're polarized, that they are reborn in order to regain experience.
yes.
Not just,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. This is the horoscope of Salvador Dali. And we're speculating that this is the rebirth. And let's look at that. Both horoscopes have the sun in an Aries sign. The Salvador Guido had it in Libra. Salvador has it in Gemini. Both have a strong trine to a stabilizing planet. Salvador Guido, we saw it was with Pluto. Here the sun is trine to Saturn. So they're not exactly the same flavor, but there's a lot of familiarity. Now both have Mars conjoined Venus. And Mars conjoined Venus is much milder here. And so that if there were moral lessons, it was, it was to the benefit. In this horoscope, the conjunction is fortified by benefic aspects to Saturn and Jupiter, the planets of the what we said was the moral objective training. So is it true? Is this enough to say? I don't know. They're both born after the last sextile, but this one doesn't have the fatalistic second conjunction. To me, I wouldn't stake my life or somebody else's life on it, but to me it seems that a very great likelihood that one horoscope is the rebirth of the other.
Why does Mars conjunct Venus and Scorpio mean that the person would have sexual problems? Also in the 12th house.
Yeah, also in the 12th house, sexual undoing. And
Because in the 12th house?
what?
Because it's in the 12th house?
Yes.
And Scorpio.
Yeah, and Scorpio, and it's conjoined to the Pleiades. Now, if some of you want to do some, want to help me, I need help. There's a famous case in, it's recorded in a book, I forget about it. It's a very popular book, which takes documented cases of people who remember past lives. And there's a case of a young man, I must be in his 20s now, or maybe even a little older, that he had been in a plane in the Second World War. And it is so super documented, he knew everything about his previous life and the nicknames of everybody that was in the plane, and recognized them when he was brought to them, the ones that had survived the Second World War. If some of you would like to do me a favor and get both horoscopes, I'd really love that. I'd like to understand that. In fact, if you could get a third horoscope the day that the plane was shot down, if you could even get the time, that would be a wonderful present.
What's the book?
I think it's Life After Life or something like that.
The story was online. It was
Yes.
going around. So.
Yeah. Okay, but I would very much appreciate it. You'll have to do the research because these days I don't have the time for that. I'm doing other kinds of things. Now let's look at a horoscope of a friend of Pierre Proudhon. They knew each other and they thought very highly of each other. Karl Marx. He was a Saturn in Pluto in the first house. He was a grave kind of man, and he wrote a lot on political and economic history. His writings became the basis of Marxism or communism, but he was not a founder of that movement. He was just an influence. Interesting thing, Rudolf Steiner said that Karl Marx in a previous life was someone who was involved in all of that feudal intrigue where people would, one lord would overtake another lord, and I think he got whooped pretty badly, and he spent his time in between lives figuring out how capitalism didn't work. I don't know. Again, looking at the 12th house, Capricorn's on the cusp and Saturn's in the first house, that would indicate a kind of a hangover, something from the past life brought immediately into this life based on history.
How long does it usually, do you think it usually takes for someone to come to be?
It varies.
I mean, you know,
On average, the people that I respect the most claim it's between 700 and 1200 years.
Oh my God.
And people who are on a fast track, it's usually within 300 years, but those are people who are working on practices to make it happen quickly. If someone is initiated, they can come back immediately, if they so choose. Because
So the guy who remembered his life as a World War II pilot
that,
would have had to have been an initiate.
no, there are other reasons why some people are brought back immediately because they are so incorrigible that they don't learn anything from purgatory and in between lives. People who are involved in blood feuds, or like in the communal warfare, like in Northern Ireland, they hate each other so much that they won't let go of their hate, and because they won't let go of their hate, they can't benefit by what happens after life. And so what they do is they keep bringing them back again and again and again very quickly until they see how futile it is, or something happens like they fall in love with someone and they break that cycle, and then they can benefit from the afterlife purgatory. All right. He believed that with his second conjunction, he believed that he was at the end of the aristocracy. He believed that he was at the end of the capitalist oligarchy. And he believed that that was it. Of course, now looking quite a few years later, we can see that he was completely wrong. He influenced a lot of people for a long time, but doesn't mean that he was right. Now the thing of it is, history can't anticipate novelty. History is important because it shows cycles and it shows what other people have done with those cycles so you don't make the same mistakes. But most people don't operate under history. Right now, we're being screwed very badly by very wealthy, powerful people, and we don't look into history to see that it happened that way. And we're going to have to do the same thing all over again to overthrow the plutocracy that is getting stronger and stronger in this phase of the cycle. And it's going to have to start all over again with a whole new group of idealists that, all new statutes are going to have to be brought in and things like that. So, history can indicate the return of a cycle. And it can show what has happened at other stages in that cycle. But it can't show you what is new. Now, what is more likely with Karl Marx, what he anticipated and what he perhaps brought about was not the end of capitalism, but he was anticipating the end of materialism. because this is a chart that is very bound up with materialism. And I used to be in awe in the days of the Cold War, how people were, no matter whether they were left and followed Comecon or whether they were right and followed the IMF, they were still materialists. And they didn't get the meaning of life because of their intense materialism. And this is a case of someone who had a fatalistic view that this was the end of capitalism, but more likely it was the end of the materialistic outlook on life. We hope. Now, let's shift gears and do something much more light. There are probably few things that are more light than fashion mania. However, a person can get caught up in it and swept away with it. I have, from time to time, been swept away with, I guess you would call it a fashion mania. But it is something that is a very lucrative business. This is because people are willing to indulge themselves to the degree of decadence. And this is somebody who was fabulously wealthy and intentionally played to decadence. Not to quality, but to decadence.
Oh, yeah.
Giorgio Armani. And he lived, a decadent lifestyle for all to see. Now we can see this is a second conjunction, and the second conjunction and most of those planets in Cancer are square to Jupiter. And so it's sort of like saying the ship is going down, so let's have fun. Let's have a good time with it. Jupiter's in Libra, which is sensitive to fashion kinds of issues, and it's trine to Venus, so it's got a pretty good understanding of what is fashionable. It isn't klutzy like my notions are. And so this is somebody that made a whole life of that. In fact, he carried decadence so far, he broke all kinds of laws, and that was his whole life. But his life, like Queen Victoria, was fated. When he was a child in Italy, a little child friend, bought him a grenade that he had found. And it blew up, and his sister and the other child were killed, and he was burned. The whole front of him was burned, and he spent months in a hospital. And when the war was over, he wanted to become a doctor. But no matter how he tried, he couldn't get himself into a medical profession. And then he started to become a window dresser. And it caught on. And he became very foppish. He was, I would say, almost exhibitionistically homosexual. It's the sun, even though it's in the 12th house, rules the ascendant. And he broke all kinds of laws. In fact, some people even believe that he was done in by the mob. The laws that he broke were tax laws. And yeah. Okay. Now, the last horoscope is one that is a mystery to me. And I'll tell you what I think, but I can't say that it's true.
Which one is it, the Lloyd Blake?
No.
That's a trine.
Now, this is the horoscope I'd like everybody to think on. It's a horoscope of somebody who was born under a last conjunction but whose life was like a first conjunction. Marlon Brando. Now, method acting was accepted in Europe long before it was in the United States. It affected all of the arts, dance, acting, and everything else. Stanislavski was quite an influential person. But it didn't take in the United States, especially in the movies, until Marlon Brando came along. And he changed Hollywood. Martin Scorsese says that you could divide all of the history of movies in Hollywood into two parts, before Brando and after Brando. This is an accurate horoscope. It's a last conjunction. Why would he be such a starter born under a last conjunction? He was subjective. You never knew what he was, mumbled. You never knew what he was saying. And it's accurate because he hated his father. The sun and moon are square to Pluto and square to Mars. He had an active, violent hatred of his father. Both of his parents were alcoholics. So it's accurate. I think what the horoscope means is something that's important that I brought up when we talked the last time we met. I said it was more important that two planets are in aspect than that they are in a first or second aspect. And I said it was more important that they were in a square or an unpleasant aspect than that they were in a second aspect. And that much lower down on the priority was the fact that it was a second aspect. And I think this horoscope is a demonstration of that. The character of Aries is the character of initiation, of starting things. And so that even though he was born in a last conjunction, the Aries qualities were strong enough to override that. He may have been a fated kind of person or a desperate kind of person, and the fact that he had this, that the new moon trines the Neptune, and he had so much charisma and so much sex appeal that despite the fact that he wasn't the leader, it wasn't in that phase of the cycle that you would expect him to be a founder. There is enough overriding to overcome the phase so that he was a founder. All right, that's all I have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
He was famous, but he has nothing in the 10th house.
Doesn't always have to be.
Because of the opposition of the sun and moon, does that give the 10th house?
No. If he is famous, he's famous for something mercurial, and his sun is in the 5th house.
No.
No, it's on the 4th.
Because Mercury is in the 5th house. Mercury, which rules the house of fame, is in the 5th house, and if he is going to be famous, he's going to be famous for something 5th house, which is acting.
Grand fire trine,
Yes.
fire trines.
Yeah.
And then that intense, Pluto Mars stuff.
Yeah. Yes. It is likely that there was a cover-up of a murder with his son. I forget all the details of that. But this is a chart that isn't free from that kind of thing happening in life. He was actually quite physically a phenomenon. He wasn't obsessive as a physical culturist as you would expect with Mars opposite Pluto. But when they were filming Missouri Breaks, the other actors and he, there was a break in the filming, and they walked over to the stream, and he just puts his hand in the water and whips it out, and here he gets a fish right out of the stream, and then he bites into it for like living sushi, and he blew everybody's mind. So he was, he was he had the physical capability of doing something. Ugh. Well,
Have you seen the horoscope of Steve Jobs?
no, I probably have it somewhere.
Have you poured down?